Springfield Armory built a rifle in 1922 that was never meant to fight. It used the same action layout as the 1903 service rifle. The same stock profile, the same sights, the same trigger pull, the same weight in a man's hands. Everything about it was designed to feel like the rifle the army would hand him if the country went to war. And it fired a rimfire cartridge that cost a small fraction of a service round, small enough that a soldier could shoot all morning for the price of a few minutes with the real thing. That rifle was the M1922. The cartridge it fired was the .22 long rifle, which means the round Americans think of as the beginner's round, the kid's round, the tin can round, was standardized inside the United States Army as an instrument of preparing men for combat. Not as a toy, as a shortcut to producing riflemen. It is still, by volume, the best-selling cartridge in the United States. Americans buy it by the billions of rounds a year, more than every centerfire cartridge combined. And most of the people buying it believe it won that position by being cheap and harmless. The record shows something else. It shows that the cheapness was arranged, that the harmlessness was a reputation rather than a measurement, and that the reason a .22 rifle sits in so many American closets today has less to do with squirrels and soda cans than with a decision made by the War Department after a war that embarrassed it. Start with what everybody already knows, because it is true as far as it goes. The .22 long rifle is small. It has almost no recoil and very little noise. A box of 50 costs less than lunch. It is the round you learn on, the round you teach a child on, the round that fills the bottom shelf at every hardware store in rural America. Nobody disputes any of that. The question is why it is that way, and who decided it should be. The cartridge did not begin as a training round. It began as a defensive one. In 1857, Smith & Wesson introduced the Model 1 revolver, built around a bored-through cylinder covered by the Rollin White patent. That design needed a self-contained metallic cartridge, and the one they built for it was the .22 Short. It was America's first commercially successful metallic cartridge, and it was sold to men who wanted something in a coat pocket. 30 years later, the J. Stevens Arms and Tool Company is generally credited with combining the longer .22 long case with the heavier 40-grain bullet from the .22 extra long. The result was the .22 long rifle. It was a better small game round and a better target round, and it sold on those merits for a generation without any help from the government. Then the Army developed a problem. The Spanish-American War in 1898 brought in tens of thousands of volunteers, and what regular officers saw in those volunteers alarmed them. Men arrived who had never fired a rifle at a marked distance. Men who did not know how to use their sights. The country still believed in the myth of the natural American marksman, the frontier shooter who needed no instruction, and the mobilization did not support it. Two men turned that alarm into policy. Ammon B. Critchfield was a general in the Ohio National Guard, and he had watched his own state's units go through mobilization. He became one of the loudest advocates in the country for organized civilian rifle practice, and he had the National Rifle Association behind him. Working with him was Albert Jones, a New Jersey officer with a similar view. The argument they made was not sentimental. It was administrative. If the nation intended to raise armies from civilians, then civilians were the raw material. And the quality of that material could be improved before mobilization rather than after it. The response was legislative, and it is the part of this story that almost nobody knows. The War Department Appropriations Act of 1903 created the National Board for the Promotion of Rifle Practice, a federal body whose purpose was to make civilians better shots. Follow-on legislation authorized the sale of surplus military rifles and surplus ammunition to civilian rifle clubs at government prices. The National Defense Act of 1916 went further and established the Office of the Director of Civilian Marksmanship with federal money behind it. Read that plainly. The United States government formally decided that ordinary citizens practicing with rifles in their own time was a defense asset, and it began funding and supplying that practice. There was one obstacle. Rifle practice with service ammunition is expensive and it is dangerous over distance. A .30 caliber military round needs a range with a danger area measured in miles, and a berm and land. You cannot build that behind a school. Rimfire solved all of it at once. A .22 gallery range fits in a basement, an armory drill floor, a barn, a corner of a fairground. The ammunition cost a fraction as much, so a boy could fire 100 rounds in an afternoon and the club could afford it. The noise was low enough that nobody complained. And the fundamentals being taught, position, breathing, sight alignment, trigger control, are identical regardless of what the bullet weighs. So the training value had to come from the rifle, not from the cartridge. That is exactly what the Army built. The M1922 was deliberately made to feel like the service rifle. Later versions, the M1 1922 M1 and the M2, refined the same idea, and they went to ROT units, National Guard armories and service schools, rather than to combat units. When the next war came, the pattern scaled, and it scaled fast enough that Springfield could not supply it alone. The Army turned to commercial makers. Mossberg produced the 44 US, a heavy-barreled bolt-action with a military-style sling and aperture sights. Remington produced the 513T. Winchester produced the Model 75 in both a target version and a dedicated training version. All of them were chambered for the same cheap rimfire round, and all of them were bought in numbers measured in the tens of thousands. They went to basic training centers, to Navy and Marine Corps schools, to Army Air Force's gunnery programs. A recruit could be walked through position shooting and trigger discipline on an indoor gallery range in a fraction of the time and a fraction of the cost it took to get him onto a full distance range with a Garand. The rimfire rifle was not a substitute for the service rifle. It was the step before it. Hundreds of thousands of American men were introduced to marksmanship on a .22 because the institution that would later hand them a service weapon had decided it was cheaper to teach them that way. And then the war ended, and the thing nobody had planned for happened. The training program contracted. The gallery ranges emptied. But the two things the program had created did not go away. The first was industrial. Ammunition makers had built enormous rimfire loading capacity, machinery that ran continuously and produced cartridges by the million with almost no human labor per round. That capacity did not disappear when the contracts did. It went looking for civilian buyers. The second was cultural, and it mattered more. 2 generations of American men had now been taught, by the Army and by federally supported rifle clubs, that a .22 was where shooting begins. They came home into a post-war country of new suburbs and new families, and they taught their sons the same thing, and their sons taught theirs, and nobody along that chain remembered that the idea had originated as national defense policy. It had become common sense. It had become what a father does. The habit outlived the reason for the habit. That is the mechanism that made the .22 long rifle permanent. The cheapness, though, is not nostalgia. It is engineering. And it is worth understanding, because it explains why no policy has ever been needed to keep the price down since. In a centerfire cartridge, the primer is a separate manufactured component seated into a machined pocket in the case head. That is a part to make, a part to inspect, and a step to perform. A rimfire has none of it. The priming compound is placed inside a hollow rim and spun outward by the case itself, so the case head and the primer are the same piece of brass. The bullet is plain lead, usually with a wax or grease coating rather than a copper jacket. The powder charge is tiny, fewer components, less material, fewer operations. Rimfire loading machinery runs at rates centerfire cannot approach, and there is the commercial detail that finishes the argument. A rimfire case cannot be reloaded. The rim is deformed by the firing pin, and there is no way to reprime it. Every centerfire shooter who buys a press becomes a smaller customer over time. A .22 shooter never does. Every single round fired is a round that must be bought again. The cheapest cartridge in America is also the one that guarantees repeat business forever. Both of those facts come from the same piece of engineering. The scale of what that built is easiest to see in the moment it broke. Between roughly 2012 and 2014, rimfire ammunition vanished from American shelves. Not centerfire, or not to the same degree. Rimfire, retailers put out limits of 1 or 2 boxes per customer and enforced them at the register. Buyers began arriving before opening on delivery days, because whatever came in was gone within the hour. On the secondary market, bricks that had sold for around $20 were changing hands for several times that. Manufacturers stated publicly that their lines were running continuously and that they were producing at or near capacity. They were not lying, and the shortage still did not end for the better part of 2 years. That is the tell. The demand was not coming from a subculture that could be satisfied by a production increase. It was coming from a country where the .22 rifle is simply a normal household object, and where a large number of ordinary people all decided to buy a little more at the same time. Estimates of annual United States rimfire production run into the billions of rounds, and published figures vary depending on who is counting and what they include. But no serious estimate places it anywhere other than first. Which brings the story to the part that gives the reputation trouble. The .22 long rifle is treated as safe. It is not a small round because it is gentle. It is a small round because in 1857 it was as much cartridge as a pocket revolver could hold, and because in 1922 it was as much cartridge as the Army was willing to spend on practice. Trauma surgeons and medical examiners have understood for a very long time that low velocity does not mean low consequence. A .22 bullet that fails to exit deposits all of its energy inside the body, and it can deflect off bone and travel in directions no one would predict. Because it is quiet, and because it lives in the back of closets rather than in safes, it is present in ordinary American households in a way no other cartridge is. The perception of harmlessness was never a ballistic finding. It was inherited from the training range, where the entire point was that the round was safe enough to fire indoors at a paper target 25 feet away. That is the dark reason, and it has 2 halves. The .22 long rifle is America's best-selling cartridge because the federal government, worried about the quality of its next army, spent decades deliberately putting rimfire rifles into the hands of civilians and teaching them to shoot. And it kept that position after the policy ended because the industry it created makes a round so cheap that it can never be worth reloading, and because the reputation it acquired on a 1920s gallery range still describes it a century later. The Office of the Director of Civilian Marksmanship became, in 1996, the Civilian Marksmanship Program, a federally chartered corporation that still sells surplus military rifles to American civilians today. Its founding purpose is still written into what it does. Somewhere in a rack in an armory, or a museum case, or a collector's basement, there is still an M1922. It looks like a battle rifle. It weighs like a battle rifle. It was built by a national arsenal for the specific purpose of making a young man competent with a weapon he had not yet been issued. The cartridge it was chambered for is the one that outsold everything. If you want the history behind the weapons, decisions, and failures that rarely make the textbook, Subscribe to Arms Legacy.